Hey guys, it's time to get back to the BFG. So go ahead and grab your copy and we will jump right in where we left Sophie and the big friendly giant and find out what happens to them next in our story. So we are up to the chapter called The Blood Bottler. Here we go. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, "Runt! Is you there, Runt? I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt?" "Look out!" cried the BFG. "It's the blood bottler." But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked, except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten snozzcumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. "Who was you jabbling to in here just now?" he boomed. "I is jabbling to myself," the BFG answered. "Pivelfizz!" shouted the blood bottler. "Bug swallup!" he boomed. "You is talking to a human being. That is what I is thinking." "No, no!" cried the BFG. "Yes, yes," boomed the blood bottler. "I is guessing you has snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper." The poor BFG was very nervous. "There's no one here," he stammered. "Why don't you leave me alone?" The blood bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. "Runty little scum-screwer," he shouted. "Piffling little swish-figgler, swimpy little bottlewort, prunty little pog-swizzler. I is now going to search the primroses." He grabbed the BFG by the arm. "And you is going to help me do it. Us together is going to winkle out this tasteful little human being," he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back. But now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous snozzcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish pink. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The blood bottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles. "You and your pibbling bottles," he shouted. "What is you putting in them?" Look at how huge he is compared to the BFG. And he seems a lot grosser to me. "Nothing that would interest you," the BFG answered. "You is only interested in guzzling human beings." "And you is dotty as a dog swoggler," cried the blood bottler. Soon the blood bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The snozzcumber, although it was as thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide her if the blood bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of these seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the snozcumber, large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was a wet and slimy hiding place, but what did that matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The blood bottler and the BFG were coming back toward the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the blood bottler grabbed the half-eaten snozcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. Sophie, where is you? He thought desperately. You cannot possibly be jumping off that high table, so where is you hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthy, rotsome grubbage you is eating? Boomed the blood bottler, holding up the partly eaten snozcumber. You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub squash. For a moment, the blood bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track. That is the scrum-diddly-umptious snozcumber, he said. I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a snozcumber, blood bottler? Human beans is juicier, the blood bottler said. You is talking rummy rot, the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on. But please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchet for my supper. The blood bottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the snozcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-fiddling me, is you? Said the blood bottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and I am positive you will be shouting out, oh, how scrum-diddly-umptious this wonder veg is. The BFG could see the greedy blood bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It is not healthsome always to be eating meaty things. Just this once, the blood bottler said, I is going to taste these rotsome eats of yours. But I is warning you that if it is filthsome, I is smashing it over your sludgy little head. He picked up the snozcumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, don't! But that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly, there was a crunch as the blood bottler bit a huge chunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. Ugh! Roared the blood bottler. Ugh! 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 And then he spat. All of the great lumps of snozcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. You little swine buggler! Roared the blood bottler. You little pigswiler! He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the snozcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetables splashed all over the cave. You is not loving it? The BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. Loving it, yelled the blood bottler. That is the most disgusterous taste that is ever clutching my teeth. You must be buggles to be swallowing slush like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beans. Eating human beings is wrong and evil, the BFG said. It's guzzly and glumptuous, shouted the blood bottler. And tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human Chile beans. Is you wishing to know why I is choosing Chile? I is not wishing to know anything, the BFG said, very dignified. I is choosing Chile, the blood bottler said, because I is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important I has plenty of cold eats in this scuttling hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Eskimo is a Chile bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly. Horrible, the BFG said. You ought to be ashamed. Oops, forgot to show you. There he is, spitting Sophie across the room. Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school tiddlers, the blood bottler said. I is very fond indeed of English school tiddlers. They has a nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them. You is disgusting, the BFG said. And you is an insult to the giant peoples, shouted the blood bottler. You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squinky little squiddler. You is a pibbling little pitsqueak. You is a cream puff nut. With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. Sophie, he whispered. Sophie, where is you, Sophie? Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. I'm here, she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. Oh, I is so happy to be finding you all in one lump, he said. I was in his mouth, Sophie said. You was what? Cried the BFG. Sophie told him what had happened. And there I was telling him to eat the filthsome snozcumber, and you was all the time inside it, the BFG cried. Not much fun, Sophie said. Just look at you, you poor little chiddler, cried the BFG. You is all covered in snozcumber and giant spit. He set about cleaning her up as best he could. I is hating those other giants more than ever now, he said. You know what I should like? What? Sophie said. I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one. I'd be glad to help you, Sophie said. Let me see if I can think up a way of doing it. The next chapter is called Frobscottle and Whiz Poppers. By now, Sophie was beginning to feel not only extremely hungry, but very thirsty as well. Had she been at home, she would have finished her breakfast long ago. Are you sure there's nothing else to eat around here except those disgusting smelly snozcumbers? She asked. Not even a fizzwinkle, answered the big friendly giant. In that case, may I please have a little water, she said. Water, said the BFG, frowning mightily. What is water? We drink it, Sophie said. What do you drink? Frobscottle, announced the BFG. All giants is drinking frobscottle. Is it as nasty as your snozcumbers? Sophie asked. Nasty? Cried the BFG. Never is it nasty. Frobscottle is sweet and jumbly. He got up from his chair and went to a second huge cupboard. He opened it and took out a glass bottle that must have been 6 feet tall. The liquid inside it was pale green, and the bottle was half full. Here is frobscottle, he cried, holding the bottle up, proud and high, as though it contained some rare wine. Delumptuous, fizzy frobscottle, he shouted. He gave it a shake, and the green stuff began to fizz like mad. But look, it's fizzing the wrong way, Sophie cried. And indeed it was. The bubbles, instead of traveling upward and bursting on the surface, were shooting downward and bursting at the bottom. A pale green, frothy fizz was forming at the bottom of the bottle. What on earth is you meaning the wrong way? Asked the BFG. In our fizzy drinks, Sophie said, the bubbles always go up and burst at the top. Upwards is the wrong way, cried the BFG. You mustn't ever be having the bubbles going upwards. That the most flubber-bunking rubbish I ever is hearing. Why do you say that? Sophie asked. You was asking me why? cried the BFG, waving the enormous bottle around as though he were conducting an orchestra. You is actually meaning to tell me you cannot see why it is a scrawny mistake to have the bubbles flying up instead of down? You said it was flush bunking. Now you say it's scrawny. Which is it? Sophie asked politely. Both, cried the BFG. It is a flush bunking and a scrawny mistake to let the bubbles go upward. If you can't see why, you must be as quacky as a duckhound. By Ringo, your head must be so full of frog squinkers and buzzwankles, I is frittered if I know how you can think at all. Why shouldn't the bubbles go upward? Sophie asked. I will explain, said the BFG. But tell me first, what name is you calling your frobscottle by? One is Coke, Sophie said. Another is Pepsi. There are lots of them. And the bubbles is all going up? They all go up, Sophie said. Catastrophe, cried the BFG. Upgoing bubbles is a catastrophe. Will you please tell me why? Sophie said. If you will listen carefully, I will try to explain, said the BFG. But your brain is so full of bug whiffles, I doubt you will ever understand. I'll do my best, Sophie said. Very well then, when you is drinking this cokey drink of yours, said the BFG, it is going straight down into your tummy. Is that right, or is it left? It's right, Sophie said. And the bubbles is going also into your tummy, right or left? Right again, Sophie said. And the bubbles is fizzing upwards? Of course, Sophie said. Which means, said the BFG, that they will all come swish-whiffling up your throat and out of your mouth and make a foulsome, belchy burp. That is often true, Sophie said. But what's wrong with a little burp now and again? It's sort of fun. Burping is filthsome, the BFG said. Us giants is never doing it. But with your drink, Sophie said, what was it you called it? Frobscottle, said the BFG. With frobscottle, Sophie said, the bubbles in your tummy will be going downwards, and that could have a far nastier result. Why nasty? Asked the BFG, frowning. Because, Sophie said, blushing a little, if they go down instead of up, they'll be coming out somewhere else with an even louder and ruder noise. A whiz-popper, cried the BFG, beaming at her. Us giants is making whiz-poppers all the time. Whiz-popping is a sign of happiness. It is music in our ears. You surely is not telling me that a little whiz-popping is forbidden among human beings. It is considered extremely rude, Sophie said. But you is whiz-popping, is you not, now and again? Asked the BFG. Everyone is whiz-popping, if that's what you call it, Sophie said. Kings and queens are whiz-popping. Presidents are whiz-popping. Glamorous film stars are whiz-popping. Little babies are whiz-popping. But where I come from, it's not polite to talk about it. Redunculous, said the BFG. If everyone is making whiz-poppers, then why not talk about it? We is now having a swiggle of this delicious frobscottle, and you will see the happy result. The BFG shook the bottle vigorously. The pale green stuff fizzed and bubbled. He removed the cork and took a tremendous gurgling swig. It's glummy, he cried. I love it. For a few moments, the big friendly giant stood quite still, and a look of absolute ecstasy began to spread over his long, wrinkly face. Then suddenly, the heavens opened, and he let fly with a series of the loudest and rudest noises Sophie had ever heard in her life. They reverberated around the walls of the cave like thunder, and the glass jars rattled on their shelves. But most astonishing of all, the force of the explosions actually lifted the enormous giant clear off his feet, like a rocket. Whoopee! He cried when he came down to earth again. Now that is whiz-popping for you. Sophie burst out laughing. She couldn't help it. Have some yourself, cried the BFG, tipping the neck of the enormous bottle toward her. Don't you have a cup? Sophie said. No cups, only bottle. Sophie opened her mouth, and very gently, the BFG tipped the bottle forward and poured some of the fabulous frobscottle down her throat. Oh gosh, how delicious it was! It was sweet and refreshing. It tasted of vanilla and cream with just the faintest trace of raspberries on the edge of the flavor. And the bubbles were wonderful. Sophie could actually feel them bouncing and bursting all around her tummy. It was an amazing sensation. It felt as though hundreds of tiny people were dancing a jig inside her and tickling her with their toes. It was lovely. "It's lovely," she cried. "Just wait," said the BFG, flapping his ears. Sophie could feel the bubbles traveling lower and lower down her tummy, and then, suddenly, inevitably, the explosion came. The trumpet sounded, and she too made the walls of the cavern ring with the sound of music and thunder. "Bravo!" shouted the BFG, waving the bottle. "You is very good for a beginner. Let's have some more." That is the end of that chapter. So next time we read together, we'll read the next few chapters. I hope you're enjoying it. That was kind of a fun one.